Hello everyone, how's it going? Today I'm going to talk to you about crested gecko diseases and health issues, how to prevent it, what to do when you already have it, and if it's really serious or not, if you can breed a gecko after the disease is treated or not, and all those things. First of all, I want to make sure that you guys know that if your crested gecko has any problem, you should definitely go to a vet. This video is not going to teach you how to treat anything really complicated. Maybe we can go over the basic things, what to do when your gecko has a prolapse, or what to do when your crested gecko has some minor FTS or things like that. This video can cover some things. It is definitely not vet approved, and you should go to a vet if your crested gecko has some serious health issues. And honestly, if you want to do some checkups with the vet, you can definitely do that as well to make sure that your crested gecko stays healthy all the time. I made a document with all this information. I am going to put it in the description of this video just in case you want to see it better and you don't want to watch the whole video. It is going to be there. There are some images. They're the same images that I'm using in this video. And if you want to see it, it's right in the description, so go check it out. First of all, I'm going to talk about things that can happen to any gecko, usually due to improper care or improper practices. So it's not related to genetics, it's more something that an owner can prevent, or usually it just happens because of improper care or it's just bad luck. First of all, the most common disease in most lizards is probably metabolic bone disease. It is usually due to improper care, but it can also be genetic. An animal with metabolic bone disease should never be bred, and if you end up as a breeder with an animal with metabolic bone disease, you should probably keep it as a pet or sell it as a pet only animal. Obviously, it would be really discounted. I would personally just give it for free to a rescue or people that know how to care for a crested gecko with metabolic bone disease. And it can be mild or it can be really serious. A crested gecko with a mild case of metabolic bone disease can live for a few more years, and they could have a healthy rest of its life without a lot of issues. But if it is serious, that animal should probably be euthanized and it should be taken to a vet, and then maybe the vet decides if it's going to be euthanized or if there's any other better solution for that. An animal with an extreme case of metabolic bone disease is not going to be happy. It is going to be suffering most of the time. So you should definitely avoid this, and if it's got to that point, you should reach out to a vet or go to a vet, and then the vet will decide what is better for the animal. Next, floppy tail syndrome is pretty common in crested geckos as well. It is also known as FTS, and it is not a huge problem, but it can get some extreme cases as well. It usually happens because there is a lack of horizontal resting surfaces, or just the crested gecko likes to rest in weird positions. With time, the tail is going to end up developing a kink. Let's say that this is the body of the crested gecko. The tail is gonna, instead of being straight, it is going to end up developing a kink, which if it gets really bad, it can end up damaging the spine of the crested gecko. And forcing a tail drop is not necessary, but it can prevent some further spinal damage. But it is a last resort measurement. You should try talking to a vet if it's really bad. Then the vet might be able to amputate the tail properly. When the FTS has got to the spine, it is going to kink also the last part of the spine. So a vet might be a thing that you want to consider. Some people don't think that FTS is something that you could breed. I think that an animal with a minor case of FTS can still breed because it is not genetic. So an animal with FTS, if it's not an extreme case, they can still breed and live a life with FTS. It is just a slight deformity that angles their tails. A kink tail is not the same thing than FTS. A kink tail usually is not just one kink, it's usually a few kinks, slight or extreme on the tail, usually caused by a lack or excess of calcium. It can also mean that it is a start of metabolic bone disease, and it can also be due to a lack of hydration. If they are minor kinks and they don't get worse, the animal can be bred if it's proven that it is not metabolic bone disease. And if there's only one kink, it is probably caused by an accident, and it is not the same thing than a kink tail caused by calcium deficiency or a calcium excess. A tail drop is not necessary unless it's really bad and it could cause the spine of the crested gecko to kink as well or something like that. It is important to know if your crested gecko has good calcium reserves or not, and if they don't, you should add calcium to their powder diet, or you should dust crickets, dubias, mealworms, whatever you feed them, you should dust them in calcium and make sure that they get that tail better. If it's dehydration, get the humidity up, and if it's metabolic bone disease, just do everything better, because it is kind of hard to get an animal to get metabolic bone disease unless it's not genetic. I've also heard a few things about crested geckos that are pretty dumb. Some people think that crested geckos don't have bones in their tails. It is a tail, it is a vertebrate, so they obviously do have bones in their tails the same way that they have bones in their spines. It's like saying that humans don't have bones in their spine or something like that. So yes, they do have bones, and they can fracture, they can break, they can be bent if there's a bad accident. So you do want to take care of their tails as well. As you all know, crested geckos only have one tail, and if they lose it, they lost it. So it is important to take good care of that tail as well, because they do use it, and it is better to have a crested gecko with a tail than a crested gecko without. Now, this doesn't mean that a crested gecko without a tail is gonna die or anything. Most crested geckos in the wild do not have a tail. A lot of crested geckos that breed end up losing their tails because they are too harsh or something like that. A lot of crested geckos just suddenly drop their tail because a lot of crested geckos just get scared in their enclosure. They might not be even with another crested gecko and drop their tail. However, during the time that they have the tail, it is important to keep a proper care and make sure that that tail stays healthy. Now, hemipenal prolapses are pretty common. If you've bred crested geckos, you probably have seen a females that take a few minutes to get their hemipenes back in, and this is normal, but it can obviously have some extreme cases where the hemipenes do not go back in. It might require of it if it does not go back in soon. Usually 24 to 48 hours is already enough time for a crested gecko to put their hemipenes in. If it's been 48 hours, you should definitely go to a vet. I start to freak out about the second or third hour. It's only happened a few times, and all of them have gone back in. Usual home solution is just to give them a warm bath. Some people do a sugar bath or a honey bath. You can put like a small drop of honey, organic honey. It shouldn't have any added stuff. You can put a few drops of honey and some water, warm water. Give it a stir. Put the crested gecko there for 20-30 minutes. Obviously not a lot of water. It is not a bath where the gecko can swim. It is a bath where the hemipenes are covered, but the crested gecko can still stand upright. An inch is enough. It obviously depends with the size of the crested gecko. If you breed a crested gecko too young, this is more common to happen. So if you have a 30-gram male and you pair him up with a female, it is more common to have a hemipenal prolapse than a 50-gram male. So soaking in warm sugar water or honey water, medical grade honey, is always a good option. It's something you should try. And if it doesn't work, put them in a really moist carrier, take them to the vet and get it properly put in or even amputated. Most reptiles have two hemipenes and they are independent, so they don't need both hemipenes to breed. If they only have one hemipene and they are properly treated and they have properly recovered, that crested gecko can breed. It might be harder for them to properly breed because if you've seen them mate, the crested gecko will go to either side and then they will only get one hemipene out and insert it in the female. The problem is maybe the crested gecko doesn't know that it is missing a hemipene on that side, and maybe it goes to that side and tries to stick the hemipene out and it doesn't have one. So it might be harder. It might take a few more tries if you want to breed them, but it is not genetic. It's usually caused because of an accident, and it can be bred if the crested gecko is still healthy and is still eating after it's recovered. I would give it a few months because it is more of a serious amputation. Make sure that your crested gecko stays hydrated and that the hemipenes go back in. Also, don't breed males that are under 35 grams. There are some males that are just smaller and they are sexually mature at 3 or 4 years old and they're 35 grams. You can breed them, but Even if you have a 45-gram male that is only 1 year or 2 years old, you should not breed that male. There's more risks of having a hemipenal prolapse. I'm sure that in the wild there are crested geckos that breed at 20, 30 grams and maybe nothing happens to them, but in the wild it is a different world. In captivity we try to give them their best lives and we try to make sure that nothing happens to them. We don't want to take any chances or any risks, so that's how we do it in captivity. We want to make sure that our crested geckos stay healthy, and that's why we have breeding sizes and breeding ages. Dystocia or egg binding happens in females. It can be prevented by breeding females over 40 grams and providing them with a properly sized lay box. If a female does not feel safe to lay, she might not lay at all, and that might cause the eggs to stay inside of her. They could maybe even rot inside of her, and egg binding can be a serious issue. By the time you know that your crested gecko is a female, so by 20-25 grams, you're gonna have to add a lay box, because they might start producing eggs. They're gonna be duds probably. They're probably not gonna be fertile. You know that crested geckos can undergo parthenogenesis, but the vast majority of crested geckos did not undergo this process. So you don't even have to incubate them, but they might lay some eggs. So it is not bad that they lay eggs, obviously, but they need to be able to lay eggs. So if you have a bioactive enclosure, they probably have enough room and enough height for them to lay eggs. But if you're housing in paper towels, mulch, or something like that, you should definitely add a lay box. I use sphagnum moss. It works the best. Some people use cocoa fiber or a mix of both. Sphagnum moss does not make the eggs dirty. We like to keep proper track of the eggs and label them, so that's why we like them to be clean. Also, sphagnum moss does not really carry a lot of bacteria or mold or anything, while a bioactive substrate is really bioactively rich, so it's gonna have a lot of bacteria. It's gonna have a lot of like maybe wood mites, springtails, a lot of things that could potentially eat or harm the eggs. So that's why we do sphagnum moss, and we like to take them out of the sphagnum moss a few hours after. We check our lay boxes every day, and then we put the eggs in there. So going back to the egg binding, make sure that your female stays healthy. Make sure that your female that you're breeding is over 40 grams. Make sure that she has enough room to lay her eggs, and check their health every now and then, you know. If she doesn't lay for 20 days and you've noticed that her belly is plump, that you can feel the eggs under her belly, maybe you should definitely consider going to a vet. And the vet is going to be able to determine if maybe a few days more are better for the crested gecko to lay, or maybe there's a surgery that is required, or maybe they can do some procedure that can get the eggs out while keeping the female healthy. The image that I'm showing is a bloated female crested gecko, which it was a Reddit post. Some people didn't know if it was dystocia. I think this is way more than just egg binding. I think maybe the egg started to rot inside of her. There might be an infection inside of her or something, maybe fermenting and causing that extreme bloating. This is definitely not healthy, and that animal should be in a vet at that exact moment. Calcium deficiencies, we talked about this a little bit before. Some symptoms are tail kinks, reduced calcium sacs, and lethargy. It can lead to death if it's left untreated, and it can be prevented by giving a proper diet and live feeder insects dosed with calcium. Overbreeding and not giving a resting period after each season can also cause this. Other species of geckos have more drastic calcium crashes, such as lichis or chahuas. That's what I've heard. I'm not 100% sure, but I've seen some videos of people talking about this. Now you can also have a calcium excess. Physically, outside, without getting into calcium sacs, the symptoms are similar. You can see tail kinks and things like that. So you want to make sure that you know if your crested gecko has a calcium deficiency or a calcium excess. It can lead to death, and it is not as common as a calcium deficiency because people tend to not put that much calcium supplies on their geckos. But maybe some people just feed a lot of calcium because they get scared that they might cause a calcium deficiency to the crested gecko, and it can cause some serious damages. If you can see in this image, The crested gecko has huge sacs, and they're not even allowing for the crested gecko to properly eat or drink or anything. They're literally obstructing like 80% of the crested gecko's mouth. This is a really extreme case of a calcium excess, and this should not happen. If your crested gecko is in a good diet of calcium and they have a schedule and you keep records and track of how much you give and how often you give calcium. If it's not very advanced, there is a home solution. It can be reduced by feeding less calcium, obviously, and giving more liquids. And for the calcium deficiency, you want to make sure that you give them extra calcium so that they can get those sacs properly growing and that they can start breeding again if they were breeding, and so that they can honestly live a healthy life. This is an image of calcium sacs that are pretty healthy. They are big and chunky, and they're gonna be able to produce some eggs. This image is from Altitude Exotics, and this is an image for you to compare and see if your crested gecko is healthy. Male sacs are gonna usually be smaller, so if your male doesn't have huge calcium sacs, don't worry. But if your male does have some kinks and small sacs, maybe consider giving some more calcium. Anorexia can also happen in crested geckos, just like in humans, and this is not healthy. It can cause stunted growth. If your crested gecko is like a year old and it is 5 grams, that is probably very, very small. And I've seen some people on Reddit saying, is it too small for his age? He's like 1 year old and it's only 5 or 4 grams. Definitely too small. A crested gecko with a proper diet, with live feeders, does it with calcium, with a good powder diet, is gonna grow properly. And maybe a 1-year-old healthy crested gecko, if it's really slow growing, can be like 10-15 grams, and there are some 1-year-olds that are 30 grams. It is true that not all crested geckos grow at the same rate, but a 1-year-old crested gecko that is 5, 4, 6 maybe grams is probably too small for its age. The damages can be irreversible, as they can cause stunted growth, and that crested gecko might not be able to get to proper size anymore. It is usually caused by improper feeding or an illness, such as a parasitic worm or an infection, and if it is left untreated, it can lead to other issues like metabolic bone disease, calcium crashes, and eventually death. We also have the opposite, obesity. Just like in humans, there are obese crested geckos. This is not healthy, and it can cause other issues. It is caused usually by overfeeding fatty feeders like waxworms, superworms, mealworms. Usually all those worms have a lot of fat because they need that fat and that energy to undergo metamorphosis. So crickets that only have one life stage or two, maybe the egg and the premature cricket and then the adult cricket, they do have a lot of molts, but it is not the same thing than starting as a worm, then a pupa, then a beetle, and all those things that they do need to undergo metamorphosis, and their body changes a lot. Feeding those feeders that are more fatty is definitely gonna cause your crested gecko to end up more fat. You can tell they are fat because their arms are really big. I mean, you can just see how chunky this girl is. Her arms are huge, they're short, her neck is really, really big. Their crests are really big. Crested geckos store fat in a lot of places. The crests, the tails, their arms, their neck as well. But an obese crested gecko will definitely have fat in every single place of their bodies. And a healthy adult crested gecko should range from 35 to 60 grams. If your crested gecko does not get to 35 grams, it's probably underweight if it's like 4 or 5 years old, or maybe it's just a smaller crested gecko. Males are usually smaller than females. I don't know if it's because of sexual dimorphism and just the hormones, just like human males tend to be slightly taller than human females. Females need to lay eggs, so maybe they're bigger, or maybe just we make them bigger because we want them to have enough fat reserves. So I'm not sure if it's something about how we do it or if it's something about how they do it, because also males sometimes focus too much on breeding and they don't gain that much weight, while females, if they're focused on breeding, they do eat more. So maybe it's just the females eat more, or maybe there is some hormone changes and the females can get bigger. But obesity is not good. If your crested gecko is obese, get them to a healthy weight, just like this person did. You can see the comparison of the same crested gecko, really chunky, and then in a proper adult size. That gecko probably passed from being 80 grams to 50 or 40. That is a healthy adult size, and if you keep losing weight, that is bad. But if you know when to stop and you know crested geckos, you know that that crested gecko looks healthy at that point, and the obese crested gecko is way too fat. Stock shed can happen. It's usually not that common. Crested geckos are pretty hardy. So all of these diseases and problems are common, but also it is more common not to have these problems. I've seen a lot of stock shed in babies, usually around the fingers. This can cause the fingers to fall off, or the stock shed, if it's in the tail, can cause tail rot. It is important to monitor your babies. If you're a big breeder and you have like 100, 200 babies, it is going to be harder on you to check on every baby, but it is still your responsibility. If you're a breeder and you think that you can have 100, 200 babies, you are taking responsibility for those babies. You're the one that is producing that many babies, and you should be checking on their toes, their tails, their head, their eyes, everything. You should be checking every single crested gecko at least once a week and making sure that they're healthy. As I've said, I've seen it happen more in babies, usually around the fingers, nails, eyes, and tail. I've obviously had some stock shed sometimes. There's actually a picture that I posted of Amber where she had a little stock shed on the nail. It is not a problem if it's just coming out, and you can just like pull it apart. And I just noticed after taking the pictures, maybe you've seen it on Instagram. But it is a big problem if it's constricting the blood. Maybe this finger isn't having enough blood circulation, so that finger might fall off. It can also cause eye caps on the eye, which can be pretty bad. You might have heard about this in snakes more than geckos, but it can still happen in geckos. It is usually pretty preventable by giving them the proper humidity levels. And if you already have it, it is also pretty easy to remove and treat it. A vet is probably not going to be required, and this is not anything that causes permanent damages, so the crested gecko can obviously breed after the stock shed is removed, and if anything happened to the crested gecko, he should be treated, or they should be treated, and then bred if you're planning on breeding. Also, do not help your crested gecko shed unless they actually need it. Stock shed is prevented with humidity and cleanliness, not by forcing your crested gecko or helping them to shed. Crested geckos are capable of shedding on their own, and they don't need a human for it. Even if it might look satisfying or revealing to help them shed, in most cases they don't need it or they don't benefit from it. Also, they eat their shed, so those extra nutrients that they get from eating the shed is extra food that is always good for them, and you're preventing them from getting those extra nutrients. Also, to prevent stock shed, it is good to give them some rough surfaces like cork or wood or something like that where they can scratch it off and they can get rid of it properly. If your crested gecko is in a full smooth enclosure, it's going to be really hard for them to break that shed once it is fully ready to come off. They need to break it, and they need something rough to break it, something that can puncture and something that the skin can get tangled in so that they can later just leave it there or eat it. Impaction is what happens when the prey item is too big, so the crested gecko cannot digest this and it is gonna get stuck there, or maybe they cannot properly excrete it or poop this item. It can be prevented by feeding feeders that are the right size. So make sure that the feeders aren't bigger than the width of the eyes. So if the feeder is bigger than this, it might cause impaction. There are some crested geckos that are just crazy eaters, and they'll devour anything and they'll shred it before eating it. Maybe those don't have a problem, but there's also crested geckos that are slower feeders and they need some time to digest, and maybe those feeders are gonna cause impaction. Some feeders that have been known to cause impaction are those feeders that are harder and they have more chitin or some proteins that are really hard and they're really hard to digest as well. For example, as you know, mealworms, superworms, they have 3 stages without counting the egg. They have the larva, pupa, and beetle. If you feed a beetle, it is going to be more protein, but at the same time, it is going to be more chitin. so it's gonna be harder for the crested gecko to eat it. If it's really hard, it can even cause wounds in the mouth from chewing or something like that if it like stabs it somehow. As I've said, I've never had a problem with feeding superworms or anything. However, if it happens, which can happen, you should go to a vet and get that checked. Also, superworms, mealworms are usually just a treat meal and should not be fed every day. So that decreases also the risk of impaction because you're only feeding it once or twice a month. Now we're getting into defects and diseases that crested geckos are born with. So genetic diseases. All of these genetic issues definitely should not be bred as they might be passed on. Some genetic stuff is not heritable and it is not passed on. For example, you see patient 0 has maybe vitiligo or something. Patient 0 is a really nice crested gecko. It is genetic because it is in his genes. However, it is not heritable because it is not being passed on. So something that is genetic does not necessarily mean that it passes on, but it means that it's in that crested gecko genes. Common one is an underbite or some jaw issues. If they're minor issues, they could have been caused by a wound or something like that that didn't heal properly. Honestly, most humans do not have a perfect jaw and does not close properly, and we still breed. However, if it's really, really serious, we're not gonna be breeding that animal, and it should be kept as a pet only, sold as a pet only, or given to a rescue, or given to a friend that knows how to care for it. All of those things. This image is from Tara Lee's Cresties. I don't know if I said that right or not. As I said multiple times, I am not American. My first language is not English. So sometimes I get some words confused and I don't really know how to pronounce some things. So if I said that wrong, Tara, I'm sorry, but I hope I didn't. An overbite is similar. It is usually a genetic issue that might not affect a crested gecko if it's mild. In this image, this is a really, really extreme case of an overbite. This animal should definitely not be bred either, and it might be caused by bad nutrition, metabolic bone disease, or just genetics. Either way, I would not breed an animal with an overbite. Any animal that has got to that point, it is not healthy at any life stages and will not properly recover from that and should not be bred at all. Neurological issues. This is definitely a no. Genetic diseases that should not be bred at all. It happens in a lot of reptiles and it can be linked to other genes such as a spider gene in bull pythons. I think there's another gene in leopard geckos. I don't know. Lily white was thought to have some wobble, which is how we call that wobble of the head. But as we know, it is not the case. Not all lily whites have this gene. It is true that not all spider bull pythons have this wobble, but it is linked to that gene. So the spider gene in bull pythons should not be bred. However, the lily white gene in crested geckos is not linked to these neurological issues. If you have a lily white that has these genetic issues with their head, obviously do not breed. But if you have any crested gecko that has neurological issues, you should not breed them at all either. They're not stable. It looks like they're dizzy all the time. They can't properly walk or jump or anything. It is usually a genetic problem, but it can also happen if the crested gecko got an infection that expanded through the spine or something like that, and got to the point where it developed some neurological issues. I've seen some people that had this happen, and it is honestly pretty sad, but it happens and you need to prevent it. So making sure that your crested gecko is healthy and that the infections never spread out is obviously gonna be good. Now I added this one, but it might not be a disease or a health issue, but I added size abnormalities. There are some geckos that are genetically smaller or bigger than usual. This should not necessarily affect the health of the crested gecko as long as it doesn't come with any other health problems. Breeding or not is optional. I would try breeding for maybe a season or two and see if the babies are healthy or not. I've really not seen a lot of crested geckos that have like size problems unless it's like caused by diet, like stunted growth. But there's a few animals that are out there that are just smaller and never get to the usual 50-gram size. It is more optional. I think this is more of a case-to-case disease. It depends a lot. Like, I don't really know much about this, It can be genetic, it can be not genetic, it can be pretty much anything. So just you as a crested gecko breeder should have enough of an education to be able to decide if your crested gecko should be bred or not. If you don't want to breed them, it's fine. If you want to breed them, do it with caution. It is also important to note that not all crested geckos get to the same weight, just the same way that not all humans are 6 feet, not all crested geckos are 50, 60 grams. So just make sure that your crested gecko is up to a healthy weight before breeding. If your crested gecko is 4 or 5 years old and never got to that 35-gram mark, maybe that crested gecko is probably smaller and maybe should not be bred, or if you want to breed, do it with caution. Now I want to get into a topic that is a little disgusting. It is parasitic diseases, injuries, and infections. I've put them all together because injuries can lead to infections, but it is definitely not the same thing. So if you treat an injury before it gets to an infection, that is going to save you a lot of time and money. So make sure that you know all your crested geckos are healthy, and if there is a crested gecko that somehow got an injury, get that injury treated as soon as you can. Some injuries might include fighting with other crested geckos. When you're breeding crested geckos, it is not common, but some geckos might bully other geckos and might be really harsh on them. This should be treated. This might need some antibiotics if it gets to the point where it's infected. This might just need some iodine baths every now and then. So any open wound, just the same way we treat a lost tail. If you want to see our last video on how to treat a lost tail, you'll find some information on how to treat a lost tail and what to put on the open wound. And that's what we do for any open wound that might happen from breeding or pretty much anything. I'm recording this a few weeks later because I forgot to add a little things. I don't know why. It was in the script that I didn't record it, and I'm editing right now and I saw that I didn't add it. So the first one of this list is going to be tail rot. Tail rot can be prevented by checking on your geckos on a daily basis. And even so, maybe like weekly basis. Tail rot is a slow process. It's not going to happen overnight. So check on your geckos at least once or twice a week. You want to make sure that every single gecko is healthy. It is true that the tail is not a vital organ. They can drop it, but still tail rot can expand through the spine and do way more damage. There are some animals that I've seen on Reddit that they started with tail rot and they ended up having some serious brain damage and neurological issues. So make sure that your crested geckos are all healthy all the time. Tail rot can be prevented by checking on them and by making sure that the humidity is right. If the humidity is not right, maybe stuck shed can accumulate on the tail, and then the stuck shed is not letting the airflow to pass through. Then it accumulates some humidity or something like that, and it ends up accumulating bacteria that end up eating the tail, and that's how the tail starts to die, and it ends up killing that tissue in the point of the tail, and it starts eating the tail as it develops. Tail rot is not the worst thing that can happen to your crested gecko. It is fairly common, especially more in babies. I don't know, for some reason I've seen it happen more in babies. But please make sure that it does not happen. And if it happens, there are ways to treat it. A home solution is to do iodine soaks. I do at least 5 minutes. I've only had it happen once, and it was on the first crested gecko that I ever had, so I was really inexperienced, but still I managed to get that recovered. It was with Zeben, our first crested gecko, as I said. We did 5-minute soaks of iodine twice a day, and in about 2 weeks that tissue was properly healed, or maybe not healed, but it did manage to recover a lot of that tail that was rotten. And right now everything that he has is just a little notch or a little small eaten part that is missing in the very tip of the tail. It is slightly dark, but right now, as it happened when he was a baby, he is totally fine. Some people think that the best solution is to force a tail drop. This is just not true. Iodine can solve this if you do it right, if you're patient. Patience is key in every single part of breeding crested geckos and growing crested geckos up. So be patient and your crested gecko will heal properly. It is true that many crested geckos do end up dropping their tail at some point, but that does not mean that you have to force the tail drop for them. Mouth rot is a pretty serious issue as well. Mouth rot can lead to a whole face infection, which, as we just said, infections are not good. And then if it grows, it can end up damaging the brain or killing the crested gecko. I'd say this one is more harmful than a tail drop, because you can drop the tail if anything goes wrong and there's like no other way, but you're not gonna be able to like drop a lip or something like that. So mouth rot will require a vet most of the times. Also, a mouth infection cannot be treated with iodine or Neosporin, so a vet is going to have to see and evaluate what the best option is. Maybe some antibiotics are the best option, the best way to go. So just take your pet to the vet when this happens. I'm not gonna be able to give you guys a home solution for this problem. Maybe there is, I have never heard of one. Whenever I go into Reddit and I see someone be like, is this mouth rot? It's usually just loose substrate, so make sure that it is actually mouth rot. I had a little panic attack the other day. One of my females marmalade had like a piece of moss that was super perfectly stuck in her teeth, and I was scared for a second. It was black. I thought it could be some kind of mouth rot or something, because the lip was like hanging a little bit because it couldn't close properly because of that piece was stuck in there. But then I grabbed a Q-tip and I rubbed it against her lip and it just moved, so I was not concerned anymore. And then I just put the Q-tip a little bit more and moved it around, and I managed to get that stick out of her mouth. A stick could end up causing mouth rot, so even if it's not mouth rot at that point, make sure that the stick is not impaled or stabbing the lip or something like that. That could lead to an infection. As I've said a million times, make sure that your crested geckos are healthy all the time. Preventing is the way to go, not treating. It's way better to prevent a disease than to end up treating it. So to prevent this, it is kind of hard, because you're gonna need all those rough surfaces that crested geckos need for shedding, but at the same time it could end up leading to a wound and then to an infection. Also, there are some kinds of bugs that can bite the crested gecko. For example, crickets are known to end up biting and munching on the reptiles if they are left on the enclosure. So make sure that you feed 2, 3, maybe 5 crickets, and don't leave any insects that are meant to be fed to the crested gecko alone in the enclosure, roaming around. That is not good. Also, if you're feeding like mealworms, superworms, hornworms, I'm not sure if other worms can bite, but all these 3 worms are known to have good jaws, because mealworms especially and superworms are worms that are eating wood in nature. So if it can go through wood, it is going to easily pierce the skin of the lip of an animal. So if it can pierce that skin, it is going to create a cut that can be infected, and if it does not heal, it can lead to a mouth infection that can lead to mouth rot. So be careful. I know there's a lot of things. It might look scary when you put all of these things together, but it is not that common. The picture that I'm showing here, I'm not even 100% sure if it's mouth rot or not. It's the only picture that I found, so that tells you how common it is. It is not that common. But anyways, it happens. I've seen it way more on chameleons or things like that. Also, some humidity changes can prevent this. Don't have the humidity high all the time. A super high humidity is more likely to cause infections than any other thing. Bacteria love humidity. So if you keep your humidity at 80, 90, or 100 all the time, that is not good for them. There needs to be pikes of humidity. It needs to be maybe 80, 90 at some point of the day, and then go to 40, 50 at another point of the day. Eye infections are also a pretty serious injury. It might be caused by an injury by jumping around, maybe like catching bugs, or just, you know how crazy some crested geckos are. Maybe one of those rough surfaces that you add for them to properly shed is too pokey and they got stabbed in the eye, and then the eye got infected. A way to avoid it is to prevent sharp decor, but honestly it is hard to prevent since they need that sharp or rough surfaces to shed. It will need vet and antibiotics if it got to the point where it's infected, and all eye injuries and infections should be seen by a vet. Respiratory infection, the mouth will stay open for long periods of time, they can properly breathe. You will see lethargy, a loss of appetite, etc. Infections will often make a crested gecko exhausted as they're fighting for their lives literally all the time. So they won't be doing the things that they need most, like breathing or eating or walking properly. They might be sleeping all the time. They might be really stale all the time, and you will require a vet to treat a respiratory infection. It is prevented by keeping humidity at the right level. So for crested geckos, if you keep your humidity at 80% all the time, it is possible that you get a serious infection. If the humidity peaks where the humidity is at 80 right when the day starts and then it goes to 50 when it's night, that is usually enough for a crested gecko to not develop any health issues. Honestly, most people are not measuring humidity all the time, and usually nothing happens. What we do is we keep them in tubs, we have them in paper towels, we make sure that they are properly vented enough. Tubs can retain a lot of humidity, so we have a huge mesh on top of the lid. It is like that big. I mean, it's not huge, but it is pretty big. So we have that. We also have some vent holes in the sides. We have some drilled holes on the sides of the tub as well. So we want to make sure that there is enough ventilation. Honestly, I'd prefer it to be a little too dry than a little too wet. Usually wet is better for any other things to come and infect, like bacteria, mold. It is really easy to have mold from one day to another, honestly. They poop, the humidity stays really high all the time, and in 1 or 2 days that poop is covered in mold. That is not good for the crested gecko. Some mold might have mycotoxins, and if they breathe them in, it can be toxic and they can die. Most exoterras, most glass enclosures have enough ventilation. I've never seen a glass tank that does not have like a screen lid or a screen door or enough ventilation in general. So if you keep them in glass, that's probably fine. Honestly, a chameleon tank, like a full mesh tank, is way too much ventilation, and the humidity is gonna stay there for 10 minutes and then it's gonna evaporate everything. So try to keep like a proper amount of ventilation. Don't do like the whole tank is vent, but don't do just a little few holes and think that's gonna do it. I've had, for the 65 or 64 quart tubs, I used to have only two like this size holes on each side, and that was not enough. Mold was building up, so I decided to cut a big square and put some mesh on there on the top of the lid, and that helped me a lot. It is true that now everything is drying up way faster, but just spray once or twice every day and they're gonna be fine. Also, crested geckos do not only drink from droplets. I always give them water dish so that they can drink from there as well. So maybe you don't need to spray as much, and therefore you might not have to go through the risks of getting a respiratory infection in your crested geckos. Parasitic worms, I just hate them. They're usually found in the stools. That's how you're gonna notice. They're gonna be probably lethargic, honestly. They're gonna be fighting for that infection to be gone, but maybe they don't get it gone. So it can cause several symptoms like diarrhea, weight loss, lethargy, and death if it's not caught in time. A vet is needed in most cases. They're gonna have you give them a proper treatment. If you have more than one crested gecko, check on all of the others because they're probably spread. It's such a pain in the bottom. I've never had it happen with worms. I've had some mites that are not predatory. I don't like mites at all. But I've had some wood mites going in the enclosure and coming out, and they're just everywhere at this point. They're not bad. They're honestly just like springtails or isopods. They're the tridivores, but they can climb any surface, and I hate that. I hate that they can be everywhere. So going back to parasitic worms, it can be prevented by feeding quality feeders and using preventative products or supplements. And once they have it, there are usually some easy treatments. Like some companies offer like a natural dewormer. I don't know the efficiency of those. I don't know if they are really good at preventing or treating worms. I would assume a natural treatment is not as good as a vet prescribed treatment, but I'm not sure. I've never had this issue, and I hope that I never do. So that's why it's also good to breed your own feeders. Make sure that you know the company that breeds your feeders if you're not breeding them. All those things, feeders are usually where they come from, if not other reptiles. So if you go to an expo or something like that, maybe someone has been handling a rabbit tail from one station that has some parasites, and then somehow they hold your crested gecko, that crested gecko licks the hand where an egg of that parasite was, and they somehow get worms. It is not how I would think that a crested gecko gets a worm, but it happens by ingesting an egg of that worm. So you want to make sure that your feeders are parasite free, and if you see one feeder that has a parasite, just immediately call that company and tell them. Maybe they'll give you a refund, or maybe they even will guide you through how to care for those geckos. And if they don't, well, you have to go to a vet and get it treated. Parasitic mites. I haven't seen a lot of parasitic mites in crested geckos. There are parasitic mites for pretty much any animal. For humans, it's like lice. For mice, you have fur mites. For snakes, you obviously have those big black snake mites. There's a lot of mites. There's a lot of subspecies. If you see them around the enclosure, they might be wood mites, but if you see them in the eye, in the vent, between the fingers, all those things, they're usually predatory mites. They're parasitic, and they're just disgusting little creatures. They will need treatment, and a vet is recommended. There are some treatments that are just from the surface. You can just like apply it where the area is, and I think there's some other treatments that are digested and then somehow kill the mites. It will spread fast, so if one of your geckos has it, probably the rest of the geckos do, or at least the geckos in the near areas. It is a really big pain, so you're gonna have to deep clean everything. Like for 2 or 3 weeks, you're gonna have to be cleaning enclosures almost every day. And that's one of the reasons why I do not do bioactive for all of my animals, because if one day something gets in my animals, it is going to probably spread to the rest of them. It is way easier to clean when you only have a few paper towel enclosures than when you have a bunch of glass bioactive enclosures. A broken spine, I don't think I can say much about this. It will definitely need a vet, surgery, and maybe euthanasia. A broken spine is almost a death sentence to any animal, and I think it should just be euthanized. They will most likely be in a lot of pain. They will stop eating, and they will either die in pain or recover after intensive care, but I don't really think a lot of animals get to recover from this. This picture is crested gecko that has metabolic bone disease. It's not just spine fracture. It's not like the crested gecko fell and it broke its spine, but I couldn't really find a lot of pictures about this. There's a few people that post about it but never provided pictures, so I didn't get any pictures. A broken tail can happen because of a bad fall or a tail stuck in the lid or door, and then you're closing it and you pinch it and the crested gecko tail breaks. The gecko might drop the tail after the accident, or it might keep the tail. A vet might be needed, or you could force a tail drop. I don't support unnecessary tail drops, but if the injury is very bad and there is no way around it, just you can drop the tail. It is really not that bad. It happens a lot. And that animal is just not going to have a tail for the rest of its life. An animal without a tail might be better than an animal with a tail that is not functional, or that it can possibly rot or things like that. Tail loss, no need to freak out, happens often. If they get scared of a loud noise or handling or mating, many times males will bite the female's tails when mating right where they drop it, and that will cause the female to drop it. I've only had one case where the female drops the tail, so it is not really common, but it happens. Some treatment might be a good idea. For example, I put some iodine, some people put neosporin. You can definitely watch our video on what to do when your crested gecko loses its tail, and you'll have a bit more of an idea after watching that video of what to do if your crested gecko lost its tail. Broken limbs should be treated by a vet, and they will know how to proceed. I will not get into treatment because even if I knew what to do, I don't want people to do this at home because it is a vet-required injury. There's really no specific way to preventing it. It is just an unlucky event. Maybe adding more clutter will do it. Maybe if you give them some more climbing surfaces, like more leaves, more sticks, all those things, where they can jump from one safe place to another safe place, that is probably going to prevent a little bit. But honestly, there are some crested geckos that are just crazy. They'll just jump around and cause a mess, and those are probably more prone to breaking their bones because they're just crazy. If they break a bone, there might be some way of treating it. Go to a vet, maybe they can do some surgery on it and they can get it back in place. The animal could be bred after it is fully treated if it's healed and it is not in pain anymore. Eye injuries, as I said before, they're really a serious matter. There's no way you can treat it at home unless it's just like stuck shut and you can peel it off. It might be a minor injury that can heal with itself over time. There are some crested geckos that have an injury when they're babies, and then the crested gecko grows while that eye remains small, so maybe you have a smaller eye and a bigger eye. Those crested geckos, if it's just an injury and you're 100% sure that it's an injury, can be bred. They might be partially blind, but they can be bred if they're healthy, if they're properly eating and all those things. So make sure that you know how your crested gecko is feeling. And finally, missing toes. The vet will not be required since most of them fall off and then leave an open wound. If they drop them, it is probably gonna be because of stuck shed or an injury, or maybe because somehow you got your house to freezing temperatures and the fingers got necrosis and they died and fell off. Just make sure that the animal is healthy and maybe you can breed them after if it's not genetic. If the gecko was born without toes, I would not breed that crested gecko. That is all I have for today. I hope it was useful. I hope that this helped you a little bit. Maybe you watch this video just because you're curious, or maybe you watch this video because your crested gecko has an issue. I hope that your crested gecko heals properly, and if they do have an issue, please take them to the vet. It might save you more money now to take them to the vet than later if it gets even worse. So just do the wise choice, take them to the vet, and your gecko will probably be fine. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.